Hello, friends. My name is JJ. And remember Bill C-11, the law passed by the Justin Trudeau administration that sought to force all of the big streaming sites like YouTube to show more good, patriotic Canadian content and less bad foreign content? The thing I made like 20 videos about and repeatedly went to Ottawa to testify against. Whatever happened to that thing? So, just to broadly summarize, Bill C-11, also known as the Online Streaming Act, was passed by the Canadian Parliament back in 2023, and since then, it has been very slowly moving its way through the digestive tract of bureaucratic implementation. In fact, the last time I made a video on this topic, I noted that implementation was moving so slowly, it was not going to finish before the 2025 Canadian election. And at the time, the way that election was expected to go was with Prime Minister Trudeau getting kicked out and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre getting in, and then he would put an end to the whole C-11 process once and for all, since it was something that he'd always hated. That, of course, did not actually happen. Trudeau resigned in January and was replaced by Mark Carney, who proved to be much more popular than Trudeau and wound up beating Pierre in a surprise upset. This ensured that the Bill C-11 implementation process was never brought to a halt, and it has instead continued chugging along in the background for the last year. It's still been moving at a snail's pace, however, which is why I haven't had much to say about it lately. But then, a couple of weeks ago, there was a major development in the story, one that I interpret as signaling that all of the public opposition to this law from me and other YouTubers and Canadians in general might actually be getting through and might actually have resulted in a softening of how C-11 is going to be implemented in a way that I think provides reason for at least some cautious optimism. Wild, I know. So let's get into it. But first, let us hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Incogni. So it's always a good idea to Google your name from time to time, not just to see if there are any new Reddit threads calling you an overrated hack, but also to figure out just how much of your personal information is available online. People are often surprised to learn just how easy it can be to find your address or postal code or phone number or even a list of some of your family members. Whenever you submit personal information onto a website, it is often sold to another website, and then another website, and another website, creating an ever-expanding chain of custody that can be impossible to rein back in. Unless, of course, you employ the services of our old pals at Incogni. Incogni sends out letters to hundreds of so-called data brokerage companies demanding they delete whatever they have on you. This is something they are legally obligated to do. They recently added a new feature as well, where you can now directly tell Incogni which specific sites you would like to file a data deletion request with. I've been using Incogni for a while now, and you can see that they've already filed an incredible 149 successful data deletion requests on my behalf. And I gotta say, it does make a difference, not just in terms of cutting down how much of your personal information appears online, but also how many spam emails and texts and phone calls you receive as well. If that sounds intriguing, head over to www.incogni.com/JJMCC or use the promo code JJMCC to get an incredible 60% off an annual subscription. So don't delay, start treating your personal information like the precious treasure that it is, and give Incogni a try today. So let me start by telling you something about Bill C-11 that I got wrong. I took the Trudeau government at its word when it said that the main motivation behind this law was to make Canadians watch more patriotic Canadian content on the internet. The need to defend Canada's cultural sovereignty in the face of foreign media and expose more citizens to good Canadian stories loomed large, and how the Trudeau administration attempted to sell this law to the country. But if that was truly the government's priority, then you might expect the implementation of C-11 to focus on the public, because the goal would be changing public behavior, right? Getting the public to watch different things. And that would mean focusing on how to force the big online streaming platforms to show different things to Canadian viewers using the new powers that Bill C-11 gave the government. What has actually happened, by contrast, is that the implementation of Bill C-11 has focused way more on the supply side of the supposed problem of Canadians not consuming enough patriotic media, which is to say the government has prioritized doing things to affect the overall supply of patriotic Canadian media in existence, with the question of how to get Canadians to actually watch it being treated as quite literally the last priority. And the fact that government views things in this way has become particularly clear just given how much of the C-11 implementation process has focused on the matter of whether Canadian actors and directors and scriptwriters and showrunners and other such people are getting enough money from the government to help finance what they make. Shortly after Bill C-11 was passed, the very first thing done by the CRTC, which is the government body tasked with doing the implementation, was the imposition of a new 5% revenue tax on all of the big online streaming companies that operate in Canada, like YouTube and Netflix and Disney+. This money was then placed in a special Canadian Media Creator Subsidy Fund. Having dramatically increased the amount of money available to subsidize Canadians who work in media, the CRTC then proceeded to address the pressing matter of who should be eligible to receive all of this fresh cash. And it is this question that has basically consumed the majority of the CRTC's time and attention over the last 2.5 years. Bill C-11 and the CRTC in general are supposed to boost online media that meets some measurable standard of being Canadian enough to serve the patriotic national interest. This is something the Canadian government already does for offline media like TV and radio, and has for quite some time. Government boosts media by giving it money, and it boosts media by forcing places to broadcast it. And under Canadian law, the standard used to determine whether something is Canadian enough to deserve subsidies is the same as the standard used to determine whether it is Canadian enough to deserve promotion. This is significant because those interests are not exactly the same. Subsidizing media is primarily a money matter. Does a media project require financial assistance in order to get made? Promotion, by contrast, is much more of a cultural worth assessment. Will this media project, whether it is a movie or a show or a video or whatever, make Canadians a stronger, more nationalistic, more patriotic people by watching it? Accordingly, it is hard to come up with a system that serves both of these discrete interests simultaneously. And so the Canadian system basically doesn't. It instead serves the interests of the people who have more to gain. Now, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but basically in Canada, there exists a class of professional media makers who rely very heavily on government subsidies to do what they do. They don't really know or care if what they make is popular with the public, let alone whether it is patriotic and uplifting. To them, this is a much less pressing concern than whether or not they can get reliable access to funding to keep their various creative projects going. This group tends to drive Canadian cultural policy, and as a result, the Canadian government's Good Canadian Content Certification regime has historically determined your worthiness as a good Canadian media enterprise through a narrow calculation of how many Canadians worked on it. If your production team is large and includes many Canadians, then it is easier to qualify for subsidies than if you don't. It now seems obvious to me that an enormous reason why C-11 exists at all is because the Trudeau administration was heavily lobbied by groups representing these subsidized artists who had grown newly jealous of the financial success of the big streaming companies like YouTube and Disney and Netflix and Paramount and all of the rest. These guys were making so much money, but none of that money was going to them. It just wasn't fair. And thus, as of now, the implementation of C-11 has mostly focused on how to get more subsidy cash flowing to the people who want it. The idea that the big tech companies should be understood as some sort of cash cow that every interest group in Canada has the right to squeeze a cup of milk from became an increasingly prominent part of late Trudeau-era economic policy. A very similar tax and subsidized regime to give money to the struggling Canadian news media was implemented through a different bill known as C-18. There had been a line of thinking that implementing C-11 might see the CRTC shake up the traditional Canadian certification regime a bit, just because media for 21st century online platforms, particularly YouTube, isn't necessarily made the same way as media for 20th century platforms like films and television. It's also become a bit of a joke over the years that since the government calculates Canadianness based on the nationality of a project's staff, there is nothing to stop a Canadian media project from qualifying for subsidies despite having absolutely nothing to do with Canada. A movie about Gandhi, say. But in the end, the C-11 implementation process wound up being puppeteered by the same old media interest groups who lobbied for the bill in the first place. Which is to say, the old established players in the heavily subsidized Canadian motion picture and television industry, who basically wanted to keep the certification regime in the era of streaming platforms more or less the same as it had been in the era of 20th century media. This was the system they knew how to navigate and profit from, so at best, it just needed some mild tinkering around the edges. Which brings us to the big announcement made by the bureaucrats over at the CRTC last month. On November 18th, 2025, the CRTC board officially unveiled their criteria for determining what it would take for a work of media to be certified as sufficiently Canadian in the online age. And perhaps predictably, to those of us who have been following the process, what was unveiled was basically just the same old 20th century system wherein you rack up points based on how many Canadians worked on making the media, with official Canadian certification being awarded when you get a winning score. The new system makes only the smallest sops to the Trudeau government's stated desire for more overtly Canadian themes in media. You can now get a very small number of bonus points if your media takes place in a Canadian city, has Canadian characters, uses Canadian music, or is based on the work of a Canadian writer. But overall, the majority of available points are awarded based on the number of Canadians who made the content, because, like I said, this whole initiative is primarily motivated by a desire to ensure that a fresh pile of subsidy money will keep flowing to the same media people who already mastered the 20th century subsidy system. So, as discussed earlier, the Canadian government uses the same standard of Canadian enough to determine whether media is worthy of subsidy as it does to determine whether or not media is worthy of promotion. So now that the Canadian enough definition question has been settled, the last remaining task before the CRTC is to determine how exactly the government should promote the consumption of this good, patriotic Canadian content in the streaming era. And this brings us to the good news. YouTube is very obviously a streaming platform and a major source of media consumption for Canadians. It is also a source of employment for many thousands of Canadians like myself who make content for this site as our full-time profession. However, YouTube also obviously operates very differently from the other streaming platforms, with a much lower barrier of entry to get your content on it. And unless you're a real big shot like Linus Tech Tips, YouTuber content also tends to be produced by relatively small teams. But as we've established, the bureaucrats over at the CRTC are primarily used to hearing from and making policy for entrenched interests in the traditional Canadian media scene, which is to say the people who work for the big Canadian movie and television studios. These are the people who feel the most threatened by the more cinematic streaming platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus that air movies and TV shows that are made by, frankly, better studios in Hollywood. Canadian YouTubers, by contrast, don't feel particularly threatened by anybody. We have been extremely successful on this streaming platform, and thus have the most to lose if government starts mucking around with how YouTube works. But thanks to what I would say has been quite effective counter-lobbying on the part of YouTube and YouTubers and the general public, as well as the sustained political pressure of the Conservative Party, I've seen the CRTC grow more defensive and apprehensive about using their C-11 powers to do anything to YouTube and YouTubers that would provoke even more controversy than already exists. The formal text of Bill C-11 featured some quite opaque and weaselly language when it came to defining the government's power to control a unique streaming platform like YouTube. And And this is something I've discussed quite a bit in past videos. Well, on the one hand, the legislation tries to assure Canadians that it doesn't seek to regulate user-uploaded content or social media. It also says that their regulations may apply to uploaded content that generates revenue. Back in 2023, the Trudeau administration likewise issued a supposedly clarifying policy directive saying that the CRTC should not interpret C-11 in such a way that would affect the content of everyday users of social media sites. But this just implied that there existed some category of non-everyday users, which would presumably mean professional users, who would be regulated? And does YouTube even count as social media anyway? Now, in fairness to the government, it is possible they thought they were being very clear in their intentions and that people like me were just being paranoid and pedantic. Certainly, in my multiple interactions with the CRTC over the last year, which I decided to stop obsessively making videos about because they were getting so repetitive and boring, I sensed that the bureaucrats were growing a bit exasperated with this topic because, like I said, they understood C-11 to mostly be about pushing money around. But in any case, in last month's big policy declaration updating the Canadian qualification rules, the CRTC made what I consider to be the most clarifying comments on this whole topic that I've heard from them to date. It's literally in a footnote, which I guess is itself revealing. It says, for clarity, audio and audiovisual creators, whether amateur or professional, are not broadcast undertakings or online undertakings and are therefore not subject to the Act. This means that the Commission cannot make regulatory requirements that apply directly to content creators. Now that is pretty good, in my opinion. I like that they specifically used the term content creators and said whether amateur or professional. I feel like this passage offers a much more clear and direct assurance to YouTubers than the CRTC has historically offered, using the sort of modern terminology that we use about ourselves. But what really matters is that since this footnote comes in the context of a larger decree about how to get media certified as Canadian, the CRTC is basically telling content creators, don't worry, none of this applies to you. In other words, if the process for Canadian certification doesn't apply to YouTube content creators, then that means it is impossible for our content to be either subsidized or promoted by the CRTC system, which, if I'm interpreting this correctly, means that the whole C-11 regime will ultimately just apply to things that resemble traditional 20th century media, like movies and TV shows, and the streaming platforms that broadcast modern movies and TV shows, which is not what YouTubers are, and is not what YouTube is. Okay, so with all that being said, it is probably still worth being a little skeptical. I know YouTube itself is still viewing these recent developments with a certain wariness until the CRTC actually completes the C-11 implementation process, which is currently scheduled for sometime in 2026. There will always be question marks and always the chance for surprises. And to be clear, C-11 remains a bad law for all sorts of other reasons. Netflix and Disney Plus and Paramount and all the other big streaming platforms will soon have to change the way their interface works in some way to promote officially certified Canadian content to Canadian users because, like I said, the content that they're currently offering is the kind of bad foreign Hollywood content that the government believes it has to protect Canadians from. This will make the streaming platforms much more obnoxious to use in Canada, and why all Canadians should get a VPN if they don't have one already. But at present, and in my professional opinion, as a YouTuber who has been following the ins and outs of this legislation for 4 years now, it doesn't seem like YouTubers or YouTube users have much to fear anymore. It seems like the CRTC has decided that YouTube would be too complicated and unpopular to regulate in the way that they intend to regulate the other platforms, and thus there is reason to believe that YouTube might not change much, or at all, even after C-11 is implemented in full. In many ways, the fact that YouTube has to pay that 5% tax is really the thing that matters the most to the government, since, like I said, the implementation of this legislation has revealed itself to be way more of a money thing than a cultural engineering thing. So, we'll wait and see. Hopefully I won't have to make many more videos about this, but if anything big happens, you guys will be the first to know. Hang tight, it is almost over. Thank you so much to everybody who has been so supportive of me throughout this whole ordeal, by the way. I've probably said this before, but this has been a very enlightening adventure for me in terms of understanding how laws are made in this country, and I've appreciated hearing from people saying that I've helped them learn more about how the Canadian political system works too. If you'd like to relive this whole journey from the start, by the way, I have a whole C-11 playlist you can check out. Until then, I will see you next week.